Welcome to another program in our series on Free Thinking Forum. My name is Bill Weir, and it's my delight today to have with me our first host of the program, David Breeden. Welcome back to the program, David.
Thank you, Bill.
And we're on location at your First Unitarian Society of Minneapolis.
That's right.
Where you're the senior minister.
Yes, I am.
And let's talk about what is unique about the First Unitarian Society of Minneapolis.
The most unique thing about it is that it has been explicitly humanist as a congregation since 1916.
That's quite a long time.
It's quite a few years. Also, when it was formed back in 1891, it developed out of a Darwin reading group.
Darwin, wow.
Yeah, they were reading Darwin and speculating about what that meant about religion and the nature of human beings.
They were pioneers.
They were, in both senses of the term. They were early settlers here in Minneapolis, and they were definitely out on the forefront of religious thinking.
That's exciting to realize we have that heritage in First Unitarian Society. Tell us some more about the uniqueness.
Well, the early group first off met as it was called the Layman's League, and they were working to try to keep the U.S. government from restricting the U.S. mail. And that was a long battle. Their pornography had been openly sent during the Civil War period, but in about 1871, the U.S. government decided to crack down on pornography. Pornography included, unfortunately, the facts and figures on contraception. And so the Layman's League tried to keep sex ed in the U.S. mail, but they lost that battle. The group that had lost that battle here in Minneapolis went on to become a Darwin's Reading Group, and then they invited a speaker on Darwin from Madison, Wisconsin, who became the first Unitarian minister of this congregation.
And who was that?
Henry Simmons.
Ah, yes, I've heard of him. Can you tell us more about him?
Well, he's an interesting fellow in that he was deaf. And so he had a little bit of a hard time speaking clearly because of his deafness, but he apparently was a very exciting speaker. And he was known all over the Midwest for his Darwin lectures. And so the Layman's League invited him to Minneapolis, said, come on and talk, we'd like to hear what you've got to say. He was so popular here in Minneapolis that the Layman's League said, well, why don't you just stay? We'd be willing to pay you to stay. And he said, well, I'd be glad to, but you've got to become a Unitarian congregation because I'm a Unitarian minister. And so they signed the papers and became a Unitarian congregation because of that.
Wow, on the insistence of the future minister.
Yep, absolutely, yep. And that was, they never dreamed of becoming Unitarian, actually. So he was the first minister, and Barbara Euland, who became a novelist, was one of the people in his congregation, and she wrote a memoir in which she said that Henry Simmons talked much more about Robert Browning, the poet, than he ever did about Jesus on Sunday morning.
Well, so we had great education in Robert Browning.
Exactly.
And his poetry, didn't his wife also write poetry?
Absolutely, absolutely. And so they were a power couple in the late 19th century. And so the lectures that went on here in this congregation were always more toward the literature and the arts in the early days. I would argue that they probably had already invented what we now call humanism, but they didn't have a term for it. And so they just call themselves Unitarians.
Mm-hmm. And so the term Unitarian came before they even had the word humanist.
Yes, yes, it preceded it. The term humanist had changed over time. It first appears in the Renaissance Italy, way back. But and at that time, it meant someone who was interested in the humanities, literature, poetry, music, and then it comes to mean later on the idea of a man is the measure of all things, as Pythagoras would say.
Yes, and but they didn't use the capital H on humanists at that point.
No,
did
they did. No, they did not. That was left to John Dietrich, who was the fourth minister in this congregation. He came in 1916. He had invented the term humanist, or began using it anyway, before he came here. But this congregation was open and receptive to inviting this guy who had been defrocked.
Defrocked?
Defrocked as a Baptist minister,
Oh.
and became a Unitarian. He was tried for heresy in his church.
Why?
After being ordained. He did not believe in the divinity of Jesus, which actually was a Unitarian idea that was quite old in the Unitarian tradition, but it was unheard of in Dietrich's denomination. He was tried and defrocked, and then hired by a Unitarian group out in Spokane, Washington.
Hired by a Unitarian group?
Yep, yes, and he lived out there. And then the group here heard about him and said, well, that's what we've been doing already. Let's have this guy out. And he came in 1916. The interesting thing about that is, of course, that the war broke out soon thereafter. It was already going on in Europe. And Mr. Dietrich was a pacifist, a dedicated pacifist, which was a fairly dangerous thing to be during the First World War. So it was a very brave group of people to invite him to Minneapolis. And then he started explicitly using the term humanist with a capital H. His partner in crime, in the humanist crime, was Curtis Reese from down in Iowa. He had been meditating on the same ideas. He had called his new religion the religion of democracy. But they got together, and Dietrich convinced Reese to use the term humanism, and they became the two horsemen of the humanist apocalypse.
Well, that's quite a history, that here in Minneapolis we had such a major part in beginning humanism.
It is interesting because humanism in its United States incarnation did not begin in where you would think, in the more liberal East Coast, in Boston or New York City. Why that was is mere speculation. There's really no way to know why. Maybe it is something about the Midwestern hard-headedness. I suspect also...
You call it hard-headedness? I call it rational empirical.
Well, prove it to me.
And compassionate.
Yeah, prove it to me certainly was the call of the day. Most Unitarian ministers at that time were educated at the Harvard Divinity School, which had long turned out Unitarian ministers. The Harvard men were not all that glad to move out to this very raw prairie area, and so they began with more homegrown ministers out here in what was known as the West in those days.
Homegrown?
Yeah.
You mean the ministers grew up here on the prairie?
Or served here for quite some time. So they weren't the top echelon of the Unitarian Ministers Association of the day. They weren't the Harvard men. As a matter of fact, the Harvard men rejected humanism. It was quite a battle within Unitarianism for about 20 years, whether or not the humanists should even be allowed to call themselves Unitarian.
What era was that?
This was in the 1920s into the 1930s. The first Humanist Manifesto is a product of that long discussion, 1933.
A product of the humanists within Unitarian denomination? Yes,
yes. And the humanism by that time the word had gotten out, and John Dewey, the philosopher, for example, embraced humanism. He was a pragmatist philosopher. The pragmatists basically say that if there is no truth, there are just tools to get at the truth. And so humanism was a good tool to get closer to a useful truth in John Dewey's idea of that. And he insisted upon the redefinition of God as well.
Redefinition how?
He redefined God or the divine as observable natural phenomena. In other words, the universe
A very
itself.
different definition of God.
Absolutely. It changed everything in terms of the conception of God. The European idea had been the old guy in the sky, as we say, with the white beard sitting on a throne somewhere.
And punishing people.
And punishing people, exactly. And this new idea from Dewey and others in that generation was that God was exactly like the universe, or was the universe. When you do that, of course, you're switching definitions around quite a bit, because suddenly God can't do anything exactly. There's no consciousness to God. There's no direction or decision making in that kind of God.
But our founding fathers of this country were not theists. They were predominantly deists, weren't they?
Many of them were deists, yes.
That conception has been summed up as in terms of thinking of the Creator as a kind of a watchmaker that set the watch going and lets it go.
Absolutely, that was the center of deism. It goes back to Spinoza. It goes back to Descartes and this kind of discovery that probably God was the describable natural universe that we can figure out with calculus, and we can measure and observe through a telescope. And by the time it got to that, and that was in the 1600s, but the more educated people here in the U.S. were mostly deists. The idea then is that God doesn't have a will or a purpose in the universe. The universe just is this really well-designed watch, which was the metaphor that most of them used. Benjamin Franklin was certainly a deist and one of the great theorists of the Declaration of Independence and the early U.S. government. And of course, Thomas Jefferson was famously a deist, even called himself an Epicurean, follower of Epicurus, Greek philosopher, who was also atheist.
But Thomas Jefferson also predicted something about Unitarians.
Absolutely. He said that eventually everyone in the United States would be Unitarian.
Well, maybe they will someday.
It could still happen.
Because we find now from the Pew Research Center that more and more people are disaffiliating themselves from congregations.
Yes, and Thomas Jefferson and certainly Curtis Reese after him, what they thought was that democracy itself would destroy the European monarchical view of God. God on a throne, a rule maker, lawmaker. They thought that democracy, democratic people simply would not accept that concept of a God. It's still a debatable question.
Yes, well, the monarchies, the emperors had used God as a tool for suppressing points of view alien to themselves. It's still happening in some countries of the world.
Oh, sure. And you know, it was those Puritans who figured out that they weren't going to be struck dead when they chopped their king's head off over in England. There were no particular dire consequences of that action, and that kind of showed the European world, anyway, that maybe the time of monarchy had kind of dried up and was going away.
So here in the United States, where we had this amazing experience of creating a United States of America, we had deists, not theists, not followers of any monarchy.
Right, right. Well, Massachusetts had been settled by the Puritans, the people who had cut the king's head off. Many of them came over here and settled in Massachusetts to become the Puritans. There were other faith traditions, of course. The Quakers were also here. The Church of England, that would become the Episcopal Church after the American Revolution, was also here. There were some Methodists and Baptists at the time.
Now, speaking of the Episcopal Church, I understand that one of the Unitarian churches in the country started out as Episcopal, and King's Chapel in Boston.
Yes, absolutely. King's Chapel in Boston is an interesting anomaly. It's in downtown Boston. You can see it today. It's on the Freedom Trail, so-called. They still have the box that George Washington would sit in when he came there to worship. All that the minister did there, and it is considered an early outcropping of Unitarianism, the minister took the Book of Common Prayer, which was the Church of England and Episcopal major prayer book, and he simply took out all of the references to the Trinity. He didn't change anything else about the liturgy whatsoever. They still prayed, they still sung the same hymns, but in their Book of Common Prayer, there was no mention of a Trinity whatsoever.
So God the Father, Son, and Holy Ghost were gone from King's Chapel. And the deists determined, no, we just have a watchmaker God. The universe is not purposed.
Right, right. Well, yes, and the main thrust of Unitarian thinking that centered around Boston was if you remove the Trinity, which they claimed was not biblical at all, it was simply a tradition of the church. If you take that away and say that there's one God, then you become monotheistic, like Muslims and Jews. If you do that, then what do you do with Jesus? Well, you say that he was a very intelligent human being, a great prophet, but not in any way divine. That's how you become Unitarian. You remove two pieces of the Trinity.
But I understand that the early Unitarians in America did not choose to be called Unitarian. They wanted to be known as rational Christians.
They did, Christianity stayed in Unitarianism. Here in the Twin Cities, for example, we have Unity over in St. Paul that is still very much a Unitarian Christian congregation. It is explicitly a theist congregation, and that goes all the way back to those roots. In Massachusetts, the Puritan groups split into two different pieces. One group became the Unitarians, and the other group became what was known as Congregationalists. And nowadays, they're generally United Church of Christ. We have a very large UCC / Congregationalist church here in the Twin Cities, as a matter of fact.
Yes, a good neighbor.
Yes, they are a good neighbor. And if you travel in Massachusetts and New England in general, you will often see two churches in town. The oldest one is probably Unitarian, and the second oldest is probably United Church of Christ.
Well, isn't that because of the meaning of parish versus church there in New England? The parish was the geographical area that got to vote on, and their taxes supported that church.
Yes, absolutely, and that was that became a bone of contention later on. But in Massachusetts, it really was a theocracy, and you were in the parish and you paid taxes to support the preacher and the teachers that were in that particular parish. What began to happen is that some people, of course, didn't particularly want to go to church, and so people in the parish simply stopped going to church.
Some people.
Some of them did.
Yeah.
And some people continued going to the church.
And they were considered members of the church then.
Right.
But not all the people who were being taxed were there in the parish were members of the church.
Absolutely, absolutely. And what began to happen then is the people who were going to the churches, the church attenders, were becoming more and more liberal Christians because they were getting these young men out of Harvard Divinity School who were already swinging toward the Unitarian way of thinking. So they became more and more liberal. The people outside who weren't listening to these people stayed in their older Puritan format. And so they got more and more resentful of paying this guy that they didn't even agree with theologically.
So was that kind of a bringing on the Unitarian crime, as you called it a moment ago? I don't see it as a crime, obviously, but to affirm the right of the tolerance that of neighbors.
Right, right. Well, yes. I mean, the interesting thing about the whole setup there was that the Puritans, when they came, and no one really knows why they did this. It could be that they thought they were coming to the United States and then they would return to England as soon as the politics changed a little bit. That could be the reason.
Once England got straightened out,
once England got all Puritan, they would go back. It may have been that, or maybe they really were planning a more democratic process, a forethought. But for whatever reason, all of the Puritan churches were completely independent. That is, the Harvard Divinity School was started in order to turn out Puritan ministers. John Harvard was a Puritan and also a minister, and also a brewer. You know, I always say that he was a very intelligent man to start a college right across the street from his brewery.
Oh yes,
and you know that's entrepreneurship, American style. But so these very liberal ministers were being turned out, and they were going into the churches, and they began preaching these very, very liberal ideas. But there was no central authority, there was no pope in Massachusetts to stop them. If the people of the church liked the minister, they listened, and they would often convert to Unitarianism.
But more often it was the choice of the parish, the geographical area that provided the tax support for that congregation that determined we want to have a Unitarian minister.
Well, yes, yes. So that's what began to pull apart then. As long as the Puritans had hegemony in the area, that was fine. But Quakers began to move in. Universalists, the other half of Unitarian Universalism, began to move in. And they were quite resentful of having to pay taxes to support these liberal ministers that they didn't agree with. And so eventually there was a lawsuit in the Dedham case, and there was this they put a stop to the theocracy in Massachusetts.
Now, we've never had that out here in Minnesota, have we?
Nope, no. But I would argue, you know, if you stop to think about why did the Twin Cities become very, very liberal, especially with Christianity, to become Unitarians. I think one of the reasons probably is that the settlers here, who were mostly from the Scandinavian countries, were coming out of state churches. And you don't agree or disagree with the state church, you're just born into it.
Well, in Norway, Sweden, Denmark, they were supporting the state churches.
Right, which were Lutheran.
Yeah.
And so, but when people got over here, they no longer had to stay in the state church. They could do something else. So they could go form reading groups and read Darwin instead.
Aha.
And I have a suspicion that's why this very, very liberal congregation is in the Twin Cities and not in Boston or in New York City.
But you mentioned the Universalist Unitarian connection. That was made back in what, 1970?
1961.
61. And that had been brewing for a long time. They had been working together on children's education and things like that. But the Universalists were really prominent in early Minneapolis, as I recall.
Yes, yes. The Universalists were one of the fastest growing religions after the American Civil War. They were circuit riders, and they were going out into the western part of the country, into the outback and starting churches. They were Christian. They were Trinitarian. The real idea that they had was that everyone goes to heaven. There is no eternal damnation.
No eternal damnation.
Right, right.
No.
And so the Universalist is that everyone goes to heaven.
And no purgatory?
There's no purgatory, there's no hell. Everyone goes to heaven.
Wow.
Universally.
Now, were early Unitarians in here prominent in government, or education?
Oh, yes, absolutely. One of the interesting things about the Unitarians is that when they started moving west, it was the more affluent lawyers, doctors, and land speculators who were coming out here to the west.
Mm-hmm. So this tradition continues today in some sense, but because we certainly have very prominent educators. A recent funeral for one of the very prominent ones that had been with Honeywell.
Yes.
Would you perhaps refer to that?
Well, the dedication to education that's so much a part of Unitarian Universalism goes all the way back to those Puritans and to the Protestant Reformation in Europe. They believed that the Bible should be in your native tongue, so printed in English, and that everyone should read it. And again, the Puritans get a bad rap in some ways. They were liberal in some ways. And one of them was that you had to read the Bible yourself and figure it out for yourself. And then your individual consciousness was the decider in whether you were saved or not, for example, because they were Calvinistic, and how to live your life. And it wasn't anybody else's business. So that idea of education, we had to educate people. We had to educate them well so that they could comprehend the Bible and so that they could make informed decisions about how they were going to act in the world.
Well, but this really leaves us on having very individual sense of whether I am on the right track or not.
Right. Exactly. Well, and that's the Unitarian tradition was to be creedless, and that's why the humanists were finally allowed to remain Unitarians. Is that if you don't have a creed to hold you back, there's not a lot of ways to stop those more liberal and forward-thinking ideas.
So, how does the First Unitarian Society unite?
Well, it's deeds, not creeds. We try to do good in the world, but we don't try to tell anyone how to think.
And more focus on values.
Yes, absolutely. It's not what you believe; it's how you act in the world.
And certainly, we've heard about standing on the side of love. In many situations. 2010, when we had the Unitarian Universalist Association General Assembly here, there was quite a number of people coming out to the park to express their conviction of standing on the side of love. Many of them members of this congregation, but congregations from across the country.
Oh, absolutely. Standing on the Side of Love is a subsidiary of the UU Association of Congregations. They have great yellow T-shirts, and a lot of people wear them to demonstrations and that kind of thing.
Well, thank you, David. This has been a great first program. We'll be continuing in the next program our conversation. Thank you for tuning in.